Peace be with you. My name is Grant Glowiak, Director of Youth Ministries at the Union Church of Hinsdale. And in this particular video series, we're talking about the Christian concept of grace. Now, there are many different definitions for the word grace. So for those of you who might be unfamiliar with this term, yes, it does refer to a prayer or blessing, some of us say before meals, but it also refers to a much larger theological concept. To boil it down as much as possible, it has been described as the unmerited mercy of God, the undeserving favor of God. Now, there's a lot of we're all terrible sinners, and can you believe God loves us anyway sort of talk with this topic, which I don't love. Catherine Tanner, author and professor at Yale's Divinity School, defines it as God's favor and all the ways God's favor is expressed in creating the world, forgiving and remedying sin, offering spiritual and moral sanctification, and so on. And I like that definition more. But either way, it's the idea that prior to us existing, you and me, all of humankind were, continue to be, and always will be loved infinitely by God, regardless of whatever sinning we may engage in. And for someone like myself, who's no stranger to sinning, that is great news, right? At the 907 Young Family Service, we often say there is nothing so big, there is nothing so bad that can separate you from the love of God, or separate us from the love of God. And that's helpful for those little ones to learn, because they will grow up, and if they're anything like me, engage in all sorts of less than sanctified behavior. And it is helpful to know that even when we make mistakes, God still loves us. Now, this concept can be misused. Dietrich Bonhoeffer talked about cheap grace versus costly grace. I'm only going to touch on it briefly, so if you want to dive a little deeper into that, you should check out Mike's video on grace. He's going to be reflecting on this idea much more substantially than I am here. Bonhoeffer, and I'm quoting here, claimed the justification of the sinner in the world degenerated into the justification of sin and the world. Costly grace was turned into cheap grace without discipleship. So the misuse of grace looks something like, oh, well, if God loves me no matter what and will forgive me for all the terrible things I do, then I'll just go ahead and do whatever I want. Cheap grace is grace with no discipleship required. No need to confess any wrongdoing or turning away from sin and turning towards God, because God will forgive me no matter what. Now, this is obviously not what a life of discipleship looks like. And if you want to hear how Bonhoeffer addresses this, you'll have to check out Mike's video, because I can only cover so much in mine. But I wanted to bring up the idea of cheap grace because I think it plays a major role in how we've typically thought of grace, and I hope to challenge that a bit. My challenge to the Orthodox way of thinking about this is in fact motivated by Catherine Tanner's work on grace and economics. See, I think the church has thought about grace too much as something individual. God individually loves you, and so you can experience grace. And I don't think that's wrong, but I think it is reflective of our highly individualistic society. I want us to talk about grace as something corporate. What that might mean for transformation. What can grace do on a social, economic, and even global level? So let's return to Tanner's definition of grace. God's favor and all the ways God's favor is expressed. So because God is infinite, this favor then extends infinitely. The favor is tailored to the individual. For example, if we're operating out of the good place model of the universe, there's no way that the sum total of my sins are going to be the same as the sum total of yours. So in this example, let's be serious here, I'm going to need a lot more grace than you if you measured grace in that way. But God just gives grace away. It is in proportion to whatever each person needs. So, although Christianity, or perhaps more specifically the Bible, may not have much to say explicitly about modern day economics, this grace economy might be a starting place. At least that's what Tanner argues, and I agree with her. God distributes grace non competitively. There is nothing I can do to earn more of it, and everyone will get what they need. Now, if we structured our financial economy like that, that would be a pretty major overhaul of the current system. We'd be prioritizing everyone getting what they need instead of, well, prioritizing rich people. We could be prioritizing parental leave, which even I don't get, or healthcare for all, wages that track with the top earners, productivity, or even just inflation, more company retirement funding, mandatory paid sick leave, just to name a few. And what I mean by prioritizing rich people is the primary measurement for the strength of the economy is the stock market. So we value how the stock market is doing. However, the wealthiest 10% of the country, meaning folks with a net worth of $1.2 million or more, own 84% of all stocks, including pension plans, 401ks, IRAs, mutual funds, and the like. So if our measurement is the market and we prioritize shareholder value maximization, which 84% of benefits the top 10%, then I think it's fair to say our current system doesn't prioritize everyone getting what they need so much as making rich people richer. And with $806 billion in stock buybacks in 2018 alone, I think it's safe to say that the profits from corporations aren't going to increasing wages, but trickling right back into the shareholders' pockets. Now, you may be saying to yourself, whoa, Grant, we've run pretty far afield of God's grace, haven't we? I mean, God is infinite. So, of course, God can hand out infinite grace. But to suggest that our circulation of goods be based on getting everyone what they need, we don't have infinite goods. And furthermore, people should get what they work for, get what they deserve, which the market determines. Tanner's point and mine in this video is that God's grace provides a direct critique for this line of thinking. Let's look at it another way. Here's a little crash course in my personal theology. I believe the best approximation we can have for God is love. And God created that which is not God, the material world. Because God is so loving that God simply couldn't contain God's own love and wanted something to share this love with. Hence, the universe. Although right now we're just talking about our world here on earth. So God created everything out of love to love it, just in order to love it. That's why God loves us. It's God's nature to give us this grace. And it is God's desire for all people to experience full human flourishing, which I believe is human beings expressing love for one another in as close an approximation as we can to the divine love we receive from God. Now, if it's God's desire for all people to experience full human flourishing, and all the resources in the world were created by God, because God has created everything, wouldn't it be logical that God calls us to use said resources for full human flourishing? God doesn't give us what we deserve, as if God's love operates on principles of scarcity. God gives us the grace that we need. Perhaps it is time for us to think not so much about who deserves what, but how we can best make sure that everybody gets what they need. Thank you.